Miss Marple and the Watch That Stopped at Midnight. Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. The village of Rosehill lay tucked among gentle hills, its thatched cottages and narrow lanes bathed in the soft gold of an early summer evening. The church bell had just struck 7, its calm chime echoing across the meadows, and the last of the swallows dipped low over the green before vanishing into the hedgerows. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary Thursday, or at least it had begun that way. At the Rosehill Parish Hall, a crowd had gathered for the annual charity whist drive and supper. The event was one of those unspoken traditions that held the village together, a chance to gossip, raise funds for the church roof, and quietly assess who had aged gracefully and who had not. Mrs. Harriet Langdon, the vicar's wife, presided at the door with her usual mix of charm and subtle authority, collecting the 2-shilling entrance fee with a smile that managed to be both kind and faintly judgmental. "Evening, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "So good of you to come. We've been short a player or two, and you always keep the table in good order." Miss Jane Marple, small and neat in a pale blue dress, smiled and adjusted her shawl. "I should be delighted, my dear. It's quite impossible to resist a little game. One learns so much about people at cards, don't you find?" Mrs. Langdon gave a polite laugh, not entirely sure whether Miss Marple was joking. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of lavender polish and sponge cake. Old Mr. Pritchard was tuning his violin in the corner, preparing for the post-supper music, while a few of the younger villagers, most notably Vera Miles, the postmistress, and Tom Redding, who ran the garage, exchanged glances over the teacups that suggested more than a passing acquaintance. It was just after 9 when the lights flickered. A few people laughed nervously, assuming it was one of those little rural power troubles. But then a sound cut through the chatter, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. A scream. The room froze. Chairs scraped back, cups rattled. Miss Marple was the first to move, not quickly, but with that steady, purposeful calm of hers. The cry had come from the side corridor, the one leading to the coat room and the kitchen beyond. Several people hurried after her, led by Colonel Havisham, who had an unfortunate habit of taking charge in every situation, useful or otherwise. What they found there would be spoken of in Rosehill for years. Lying near the doorway, one arm flung awkwardly out, was Mr. Leonard Drake, the local jeweller, a quiet man of about 50, known for his punctuality and his rather too perfect manners. His face was pale, his eyes wide open and staring, and his gold pocket watch, always worn on a chain across his waistcoat, lay beside him, its glass cracked. The watch had stopped. At midnight. A murmur spread through the crowd like wind over long grass. Someone called for the doctor. Someone else ran for the constable. Miss Marple knelt quietly beside the body, her hands folded, her eyes fixed not on the watch, but on the small details others missed, the faint mark on Mr. Drake's wrist, the thread caught on his sleeve, the odd angle of his fallen spectacles. She said nothing, but in her expression there was the faintest shadow of something between sadness and recognition, as though she had seen, in that single silent moment, the outline of a story waiting to be told. And so it began, the murder that would come to be known as the Watch That Stopped at Midnight. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, The Village in Shock, following the gossip, fear, and first? Chapter 2, The Village in Shock. Morning came to Rosehill with deceptive calm. The sunlight touched the rooftops as if nothing had happened, birds sang as usual in the churchyard elms, and the milk cart rattled cheerfully down the lane. But beneath the tranquil surface, the whole village was whispering. By 8:30, the Crown tea rooms were already full. The murder, for there was no doubt it was murder, had travelled faster than the Morning Post. "Dead as anything," declared Mrs. Pierce, the butcher's wife, who had a flair for the dramatic. "Dropped right there by the cloakroom, so they say. Poor Mr. Drake. Always so punctual, wasn't he?" "Too punctual," muttered Mr. Lisson, who kept the grocer's shop and considered Mr. Drake's politeness unnatural. "A man like that, you can't help but wonder what's behind it." At another table, Vera Miles stirred her tea absently. She looked pale and tired. Some swore she'd been the last to speak to Mr. Drake before the lights went out. She hadn't said much about it, only that he'd asked if she might deliver a small parcel for him to the post office the next morning. But the parcel had vanished. The police, led by Inspector Graves, had arrived from Much Bennying, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a practical mind and little patience for village gossip. He'd interviewed half of Rosehill before breakfast and looked none the wiser for it. "Heart failure, that's what I say," he told his constable, scratching his chin. No sign of a struggle, No weapon, nothing stolen. Likely the poor man just dropped dead. The watch breaking when he fell. Pure coincidence. Miss Marple, who had come down to the tea rooms for her morning scone and gentle eavesdropping, looked up mildly. Possibly, she said, in her quiet way. Though I've always found coincidences rather rare in real life, Inspector. Especially when they're so convenient. Graves gave a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You were there last night, Miss Marple. You didn't happen to see anything out of the ordinary. Oh, quite the contrary, she replied serenely. Everything was perfectly ordinary. Which, to my mind, is very interesting indeed. She sipped her tea, then added, people often think extraordinary events come with noise and spectacle. But more often than not, evil hides in the most commonplace of moments, a whist drive, a shared joke, a small disagreement about the order of play. The inspector made a note he didn't intend to use. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered outside Drake's Jewelers. The blinds were drawn, but in the upper window, one could just make out the silhouette of a woman, Mrs. Helena Drake, the widow. A tall, handsome woman with an air of controlled composure. She had said little since the night before, except to confirm that her husband had been in excellent health and had no known enemies. No enemies. In Rosehill, that was rarely true. By noon, the theories had multiplied. Some said Mr. Drake had been poisoned. Others claimed he'd been blackmailed. A few, recalling that stopped watch, whispered that he had been involved in something dark, occult business, Mrs. Pierce called it, with relish. Meanwhile, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the green, her knitting bag over one arm. She greeted everyone she passed, noting, as always, far more than she said. The postmistress's red eyes. The vicar's nervous tapping of his cane. The way young Tom Redding avoided looking toward the jeweller's window. By evening, the village had grown quieter. The initial excitement had given way to something heavier. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. People watched one another differently now, as though anyone might be hiding something. From her garden gate, Miss Marple looked down the lane as the sun sank behind the hedgerows. Somewhere, a clock struck the half-hour. She thought again of that broken watch, stopped at midnight, and of the faint mark on Leonard Drake's wrist. A mark, she was certain, left by a hand that had not been his own. Chapter 3, Early Clues. It was the following morning when Miss Marple decided to run a few small errands, as she put it, a phrase that, in Rosehill, often meant the quiet beginnings of an investigation. The sun was bright but not warm, a pale English light that touched the cottages with a faint shimmer. Birds sang somewhere near the churchyard, and from the bakery drifted the smell of fresh currant buns. It was a morning that would have seemed perfectly ordinary, if not for the tension humming beneath every polite greeting. Miss Marple began, naturally, at the post office. "Good morning, Miss Miles," she said cheerfully as she stepped inside, her knitting peeking from her handbag. "Such a lovely day, isn't it? Though it does feel rather unsettled. Poor Mr. Drake, such a shock." Vera Miles looked up sharply from the counter. There were shadows under her eyes, and her usual smile came a moment too late. "Yes, dreadful business," she murmured. "I can't seem to think of anything else." "I heard," Miss Marple said delicately, "that you may have spoken to him just before it happened." The girl hesitated, then nodded. "He gave me something, a little box, said it was to go out with the Morning Post. But then the lights went out, and when they came on again, well, you know the rest. I dropped it somewhere, I think. I never saw it after that." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the neat row of mail slots behind the counter. "And it wasn't among the things found later." "No. Inspector Graves said they searched the hall from top to bottom." Vera bit her lip. "I think someone must have taken it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone was gentle. "My dear, in a village like Rosehill, parcels rarely vanish on their own. Someone always tidies them up, usually for reasons of their own." She thanked Vera, purchased a half-sheet of stamps she didn't need, and stepped back into the lane. A few children were playing marbles near the vicarage wall. She smiled at them and continued toward the jeweller's shop. The blinds were still drawn, but a police constable stood at the door. Inside, she could just see Inspector Graves bent over the glass counter, examining a tray of watches. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said with a sigh as she entered. "Can't say we're getting very far. Doctor confirmed it. Heart failure, most likely. But there are odd bits that don't fit." "Oh." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the case where the watches gleamed like patient eyes. Such as? Well, there's this. He pointed to a small ledger open on the counter. Drake kept a record of all his repairs and sales. Neat man, very methodical. But the last entry is strange. Just the words Midnight Repair, HD written in his hand. No details. No payment taken. HD Miss Marple repeated softly. Helena Drake, perhaps. That's what I thought, Graves said. But Mrs. Drake insists she never brought him a watch to mend. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. How curious. I do hope the inspector has considered other possibilities. For instance, that the initials may belong to someone else entirely. The inspector frowned, but Miss Marple only smiled politely, thanked him, and left. On her way home, she paused near the village green, where the grass still showed faint signs of last night's trampling. She stood quite still for a moment, as though listening to the whisper of the wind through the hedges. Something about the stopped watch troubled her, not the time itself, but the gesture of it. People did things for reasons, even in death. A stopwatch was rarely just broken glass and coincidence. It was a message. At home, she sat by her window with her knitting and let her thoughts drift. Helena Drake, calm, beautiful, remote. Vera Miles, nervous, frightened, hiding something. Tom Redding, avoiding questions. A missing parcel. A mysterious ledger entry. And that faint mark on the wrist, like the pressure of a rope, or perhaps a hand pulling hard at something. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. Oh dear, she murmured. People really are so very much alike, in Rosehill or anywhere else. One only has to look closely enough. And as the clock on her mantelpiece struck noon, she knew, quite without knowing how, that she had already seen the first real thread of truth. Chapter 4, The Wrong Suspect. The next day dawned heavy with clouds, one of those low, grey mornings when the air itself feels watchful. Rosehill was quieter than usual. Doors stayed shut, curtains twitched, and the hum of gossip had turned from excitement to unease. By mid-morning, a rumour spread like wildfire. Tom Redding had been taken in for questioning. Tom, the cheerful young mechanic who fixed everyone's motorcar and whistled while he worked. Tom, who had danced with Vera Miles at the whist drive only an hour before the murder. Tom, who, according to more than one witness, had left the hall for a smoke just minutes before the scream was heard. Mark my words, declared Mrs. Pierce at the Crown Tea Rooms. It's always the ones with the nice smiles. Never trusted that boy's grin. Rubbish, said Colonel Havisham, thumping the table. Good lad, Tom. Bit hot-headed perhaps, but no killer. Still, can't blame the police for checking. Bound to look bad, sneaking out like that. At her corner table, Miss Marple poured her tea calmly, her expression unreadable. She had seen this before, the relief of a village that thought it had found its villain. People liked their fear tidy, wrapped up in a name they could whisper over scones. But Miss Marple, as ever, noticed the details others ignored. She had seen Tom Redding that morning when the constable led him through the square. His cap was pulled low, his jaw tight. There had been anger in his eyes, but not the guilty kind. It was the anger of a young man trapped in something he didn't understand. She decided to pay a visit to the police station in Much Bennying. Inspector Graves was not particularly pleased to see her. Miss Marple, he sighed. I do appreciate your interest, but we're handling it. Redding's story doesn't add up. Says he went out for air, but there's a witness, Mrs. Langdon, who swears she saw him near the side corridor where Drake was found. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands in her lap. Mrs. Langdon has excellent eyesight, I'm sure, though she does tend to interpret what she sees, especially where young people are concerned. Graves frowned. We also found this. He held up a small, leather pouch, stained with something dark. Discovered behind the hall, near the bins. Belonged to Redding. Inside was a broken watch spring, from the same make as Drake's timepiece. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. And might it not be possible, Inspector, that a man who repairs engines might carry such things as part of his work? That's exactly what he said, Graves replied grimly. Too convenient, don't you think? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Coincidences are convenient, Inspector, but not always false. He gave a weary sigh. You think he's innocent? I think, she said softly, that if he were guilty, he would not have looked so bewildered when you took him. Guilt rarely looks confused. Fear does. She rose, smoothing her skirt. And besides, there's something rather odd about that watch, don't you think? How so? Oh, just a thought, Miss Marple said lightly. But I can't help noticing that it stopped at midnight. And yet, Mr. Drake was seen alive nearly 15 minutes later. Graves stared at her. Who saw him? Mrs. Langdon again, Miss Marple said gently. She mentioned it at tea this morning. Said she remembered him speaking to Vera Miles near the kitchen door around 12:15. She did not, I think, realize the significance. The inspector swore under his breath. Then the time of death. Is not what you think, Miss Marple finished, her blue eyes twinkling. And if that's true, then poor Tom Redding could not possibly have done it. He was back inside the hall by then, playing the next hand of whist. I sat directly opposite him. Graves blinked. You never said that. You didn't ask, she replied pleasantly. There was a pause, and then a reluctant smile crept across his face. You've done this before, haven't you, Miss Marple? Oh, I shouldn't think so, she said with perfect modesty. I merely take an interest in people, and people, dear Inspector, are infinitely more revealing than their alibis. As she left the station, the clouds finally broke, releasing a light rain that shimmered on the cobblestones. Miss Marple walked home beneath her umbrella, her thoughts calm but alert. Someone had wanted Tom Redding blamed. Someone clever enough to use coincidence as camouflage. And somewhere in Rosehill, that someone was watching the rain fall too, quite certain they'd just escaped discovery. They hadn't. Not yet. Chapter 5. Secrets Revealed. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving Rosehill washed and quiet, its cobblestones gleaming and hedgerows dripping silver. The village looked almost innocent again, but Miss Marple knew better. Evil, in her long experience, seldom looked like anything at all. It crept about disguised as habit, politeness, or even kindness. The arrest of Tom Redding had been quietly undone. Inspector Graves, to his credit, had released the young man without fanfare. But the damage was done. Villagers still whispered when Tom passed. The garage was emptier than usual. And though he walked with his head high, Miss Marple could see the deep, restless fury in him, the kind that came from being wronged. She decided, as she knitted by her window that morning, that it was time to tug at a few more threads. Her first call was on Mrs. Helena Drake, the widow. The jeweller's house stood on the high street, its ivy-clad walls elegant in a restrained, almost cold way. Mrs. Drake received Miss Marple in the drawing room, which was tidy to the point of sterility. Not a cushion out of place, not a photograph on display, except one, a framed portrait of Leonard Drake in his younger days. Such a handsome man, Miss Marple said softly. You must miss him terribly. Mrs. Drake's smile was thin. Yes, terribly. She was dressed in black, but not the crumpled, tear-stained black of grief, rather the well-chosen, impeccable black of control. Miss Marple, settling her handbag on her lap, noted everything: the faint scent of lilac perfume, the untouched tea service, the way Mrs. Drake's fingers twisted her wedding ring, round and round, as if it itched. I wonder, Miss Marple said casually, whether your husband ever spoke of a repair, something entered under the initials H.D. Mrs. Drake stiffened, just for an instant. No, she said too quickly. He didn't. I've told the inspector that already. Oh, quite so, said Miss Marple, smiling as though the matter were trivial. It was only curiosity. I do enjoy puzzles, you know, a harmless hobby at my age. Still, I find it fascinating that Mr. Drake's watch stopped precisely at midnight. Such a symbolic hour, don't you think? Mrs. Drake rose to pour the tea, her hand trembling only slightly. A coincidence, I'm sure. Miss Marple took her cup, her eyes mild. Of course. Life is full of them. When she left, she passed through the garden, where the gardener, George Minton, a heavy, silent man, was trimming the roses. She paused a moment. A fine morning for pruning, Mr. Minton. He nodded without looking at her. Yes, His sleeve was rolled up, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught it at once, a pale mark on his wrist, faint but clear, the same shape as the bruise she had noticed on Leonard Drake's arm. Ah, she said lightly, one must be careful with the thorns. He grunted, not meeting her gaze. Later that afternoon, she stopped at the vicarage. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Langdon, greeted her with tea and eager curiosity. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard? That dreadful boy's been let off. I can't think why. The inspector says there's no proof, but really, there seldom is until it's too late." "Quite," said Miss Marple mildly, "though one mustn't judge too hastily. Appearances can be deceptive, I always say." Mrs. Langdon sniffed. "Appearances are everything in a place like this. If people behaved properly, there'd be no murders." Miss Marple smiled. "You may be right, my dear. Though I've always found that murder tends to arise from people behaving exactly as they are." When Mrs. Langdon went to fetch more sugar, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the small sideboard, and something curious caught her eye. A small velvet pouch, dark red, identical to the one that had been found near the hall. It was half hidden under a folded napkin. She said nothing, merely sipped her tea. By the time she reached home, dusk was settling. The sky over Rosehill glowed faintly pink, and lamps were being lit behind curtained windows. Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, the knitting untouched in her lap. A pattern was forming, faint, incomplete, but unmistakable. A jealous wife, too calm for comfort. A gardener with a bruise that told its own story. A parcel gone missing. And Mrs. Langdon, who seemed to know a great deal more than she should. She looked toward the mantel clock, tick, 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 steady and unbroken. "A stopped watch," she murmured, "is sometimes meant to stop time itself. But the truth always keeps ticking, however quiet it sounds." She smiled to herself and picked up her knitting again, her needles moving softly in the lamplight. The village believed the storm had passed. But Miss Marple knew better. It had only just begun. Chapter 6, The Twist. 2 days after Leonard Drake's death, Rosehill awoke to a new scandal, one that rippled through the village like a stone dropped into a still pond. It began in the early hours, when Constable Hobbs, making his routine patrol near the edge of the woods, stumbled upon something glinting in the undergrowth. At first, he thought it was just a bottle discarded by careless youths. But when he bent closer, he realized it was no bottle. It was a gunmetal revolver, half buried beneath leaves, its barrel slick with dew. By breakfast, the news had spread. A weapon had been found. And not just any weapon, but one later confirmed by Inspector Graves to bear Mr. Drake's fingerprints. The village, which had begun to settle into a rhythm of gossip and sympathy, exploded with fresh suspicion. "Suicide," cried Mrs. Pierce triumphantly at the bakery counter. "Mark my words, that's what it was. He shot himself, poor man, and dropped dead in the hall." "Absolute nonsense," countered Colonel Havisham. "I heard the doctor say there were no bullet wounds. Not a one. You can't shoot yourself without a hole to show for it." Meanwhile, in the tea rooms, speculation shifted toward something darker. "Perhaps he meant to shoot someone else," whispered Vera Miles nervously to her friend. "Perhaps me." Her voice broke as she stirred her tea with a trembling hand. Miss Marple, sitting a few tables away, looked up over her spectacles with quiet interest. Vera Miles was frightened, too frightened, Miss Marple thought, for a girl merely caught up in idle gossip. That afternoon, Inspector Graves summoned Miss Marple to the station. He looked worn, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "We're in a muddle," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "First, the watch. Then the missing parcel. Now this revolver. And none of it adds up." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "On the contrary, Inspector, it adds up very well indeed, only to the wrong sum." He stared at her. "You've seen something I've missed." "Oh, not at all," she said modestly. "But I have noticed a curious tendency in people to see what they expect. A weapon, for instance, seems to suggest murder. But if there's no bullet wound, then it must have been meant for something else entirely." Graves frowned. "Such as?" "Threats," Miss Marple said gently. "Coercion. A gun may frighten far more effectively than it kills. And fear, Inspector, leaves very particular traces." That evening, as dusk settled over Rosehill, another shock came. The missing parcel, the one Leonard Drake had given Vera Miles, was found. Or rather, it was returned. Quietly. Without explanation. Vera herself discovered it on the doorstep of the post office, wrapped exactly as it had been on the night of the murder, the brown paper only slightly creased. She opened it with trembling fingers while half the village watched. Inside lay a small silver locket, finely worked, with the initials HD engraved upon it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Pierce gave a little gasp. HD, Helena Drake. His wife. The word motive drifted through the air like smoke. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, the firelight flickering across her thoughtful face. She held the newspaper parcel in her lap. Vera had brought it straight to her, weeping with relief that she was no longer suspected of theft. Miss Marple opened the locket carefully. Inside was a miniature photograph, not of Helena Drake, as one might expect, but of a younger woman, smiling shyly. Miss Marple's eyes softened with recognition. It was Margaret Ellison, the grocer's daughter, dead these 5 years from a sudden fever. So Leonard Drake had carried her likeness with him still. A secret love, hidden beneath the surface of village respectability. Miss Marple set the locket down, her thoughts moving quickly now. A hidden romance. A jealous wife. A weapon used for threats, not death. And a stopwatch that told a lie about time. She leaned back in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet. The pieces were shifting, fitting together in ways the inspector had not yet seen. Somewhere, in the shadows of Rosehill, someone was growing nervous. And Miss Marple knew, the next mistake would not be long in coming. Chapter 7. The final test begins. It was the kind of still morning that made Rosehill seem frozen in time. The air was pale and heavy with quiet, and the only sound was the rhythmic toll of the church bell marking the half-hour. Yet, beneath that calm, the village trembled with unease. The murder of Leonard Drake no longer felt like an isolated tragedy. It had become a mirror in which everyone saw a reflection they didn't wish to face. Whispers lingered in the lanes, doors closed when Miss Marple passed, and the post office, once lively with chatter, now sat in nervous silence. Miss Marple, however, looked as placid as ever. She had spent the morning baking a small sponge cake, with lemon zest, as the vicar preferred, and knitting a particularly complex pattern that required, as she put it, just enough concentration to think clearly. By noon, she decided that the time had come to test a few theories. Her first visit was to George Minton, the Drake's gardener. He was in the tool shed, sharpening his shears with slow, deliberate strokes when Miss Marple appeared at the doorway, carrying a basket. "Good afternoon, Mr. Minton," she said pleasantly. "I brought you a slice of cake. You've been working so hard in Mrs. Drake's garden, and I've always believed one should feed those who feed the flowers." He glanced at her suspiciously, then accepted the parcel. "Thank you, Such lovely roses you keep," Miss Marple went on conversationally. "Though I dare say they're more temperamental than most people. Have you worked for Mrs. Drake long?" 6 years, he said shortly. "Ah, then you must have known Mr. Drake very well indeed. A pity, what happened?" He said nothing, only kept sharpening. The metal rasped against stone. "You must have seen so much of village life from that garden," Miss Marple continued. "And from what I gather, you were very devoted to Mrs. Drake. Always so loyal to her, I hear." He looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Miss Marple's smile was mild. "Oh, only that loyalty is such a rare thing. People sometimes mistake it for love, or perhaps confuse the two." He stared at her, his jaw tightening, and for a brief moment she saw something dangerous flash behind his eyes. Guilt, fear, anger, perhaps all three. Then he turned away. "I just do my job," he muttered. "That's all." "I'm sure you do," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I wonder, does Mrs. Drake know how much you care?" He froze. The shears trembled in his hands. "Care?" he said in a low voice. "What are you talking about?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "Oh, nothing of consequence. But I did notice the mark on your wrist. Rather similar to one I once saw on a man who tried to pull another back from falling, only too late, poor soul." Minton's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about." She smiled kindly. "Perhaps not. But I usually find that when people tell me that, I'm rather closer to the truth than they wish." That evening, Miss Marple arranged a quiet tea gathering at her cottage, just a few concerned friends, as she called them, Helena Drake, Vera Miles, Mrs. Langdon, and Inspector Graves, who came reluctantly but curiously. The little sitting room smelled of rosewater and sponge cake. Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried grace, talking of nothing but the weather and knitting patterns, until, quite suddenly, she turned to Mrs. Drake. "My dear, I've been meaning to ask, Have you by any chance lost a silver locket? Helena Drake's hand froze halfway to her cup. A locket? Yes, Miss Marple said pleasantly. One engraved with your initials. It was found in the parcel Mr. Drake gave Miss Miles the night he died. A tremor passed through the room. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. Helena's lips parted, but no words came. Then, quietly, she said, "That locket isn't mine." "No." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Curious. Your initials, and yet the photograph inside was of another woman. A woman Mr. Drake clearly cherished." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Who was the woman, Miss Marple?" "A girl named Margaret Ellison," she said softly. "Dead these 5 years. Mr. Drake once courted her, I believe, before he married." Mrs. Drake rose suddenly, pale and trembling. "How dare you? My husband was a good man. He loved me." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "And yet, perhaps, love turned to resentment when he could no longer forget someone else. Perhaps that resentment grew, in both directions." Helena's breath came quick and shallow. "You think I killed him?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost kind. "No, my dear. I think you wanted to, and someone else did it for you." The room fell utterly silent. Inspector Graves stared. "Who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the last of the light was fading. "That, Inspector, is what I intend to discover tomorrow, when I visit the churchyard." "Why there?" Graves demanded. "Because," she said softly, "the dead are often far more truthful than the living." Outside, the evening air cooled. Somewhere down the lane, a man stood in shadow, watching Miss Marple's lamplit window. His hands were rough, his breath uneven, and on his wrist, beneath his sleeve, the faint outline of a bruise was still visible. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would put an end to it, before the old woman learned too much. Chapter 8. The Trap at the Churchyard. The next morning broke cold and silver grey over Rosehill. Mist drifted low across the meadows, and the old church stood like a lonely sentinel above the dew-wet graves. Its clock, ever slightly slow, chimed the quarter hour, and as always, Miss Marple noted the difference. She arrived early, dressed in her usual grey coat and soft hat, with her shawl folded neatly over her arm. To anyone watching, she might have seemed simply on her way to tend a grave or leave flowers. But Miss Marple had not come to mourn, she had come to listen. She walked slowly through the rows, pausing now and then to straighten a crooked vase or brush lichen from an old stone. The village was barely awake, and the only sound was the distant bleating of sheep. Yet, Miss Marple knew she was not alone. There was a faint crunch of gravel behind her, the sound of deliberate feet trying to be quiet. She didn't turn. Instead, she knelt before a weathered cross, pretending to read the inscription. "Poor Margaret Ellison," she murmured softly. "Gone too soon, and yet not forgotten." The footsteps stopped. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mr. Minton," she said without looking up. "What a surprise to find you here so early." The gardener's voice came rough and strained. "You shouldn't meddle, Miss Marple." "Oh, but I always meddle," she replied mildly, dusting her gloves. "I've found it most productive over the years." "You don't understand," he hissed. "You think you're clever, but you don't know what she was like. How he treated her. Mrs. Drake didn't deserve what he did to her." Miss Marple finally rose and turned. Minton stood 10 feet away, his cap pulled low, his eyes bloodshot. In his right hand gleamed the edge of pruning shears, small, but sharp enough to matter. She looked at him as one might look at a misbehaving child. "You loved her," she said softly. "That was your mistake." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen that night." He laughed at her, called her useless, said she'd be penniless without him. She cried, Miss Marple. She cried. I couldn't stand it. "So you waited," she said gently, "in the lane behind the house. When Mr. Drake left to deliver that parcel, you followed him." His breathing quickened. "I just wanted to frighten him. Make him see what he'd done." "But he fought back," Miss Marple murmured. "And in the struggle, he fell, or perhaps you struck him first. And when you saw the watch broken in his hand, stopped at midnight, you panicked." He closed his eyes. "It was an accident." "No, Mr. Minton," Miss Marple said quietly. It was an act of passion, and that is quite different. For a long moment, only the crows spoke, circling lazily above the churchyard. Then, from behind the old yew tree, came the sound of crunching boots. Inspector Graves stepped out, revolver drawn, his face grim. "George Minton, you're under arrest for the murder of Leonard Drake." Minton's shoulders sagged. The shears dropped into the wet grass with a soft thud. He looked at Miss Marple, eyes hollow. "She never asked me to do it. But I thought if you were gone, she'd be free." Miss Marple's face softened. "Love can be such a terrible motivator, Mr. Minton. It gives courage to cowards, and blindness to good men." Graves signaled his constable, who led Minton away down the path. Miss Marple stood quietly, listening to the sound of their fading footsteps. Then, as the mist lifted, she turned once more to Margaret Allison's grave. "You see, my dear," she whispered, "he didn't mean to harm him. But the heart rarely listens to reason." That evening, the village exhaled. News of the confession spread like the turning of a tide. Doors opened again, the post office hummed softly, and for the first time in weeks, the church bells sounded peaceful. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting quietly as the radio murmured faintly in the background. Inspector Graves dropped by, his hat in his hands. "Still can't believe you saw it coming," he said, shaking his head. "How did you know it was Minton?" She smiled. It was quite simple, really. His hands told the story, the bruise where he grabbed Mr. Drake's wrist, the cut that didn't come from gardening. And of course, his silence. Guilt makes people quieter than grief ever could. Graves chuckled. "You make it sound easy." "Oh, not easy," she said, eyes twinkling. "Just familiar. People are much alike everywhere, Inspector. Only the details change." He nodded, placing his hat back on. "Well, I'll say this, you've given Rosehill its peace back." Miss Marple looked into the fire, her needles clicking softly. "For now," she said. "Until the next storm, that is. There's always another secret somewhere in an English village." Chapter 9. Shadows After Midnight. Rain swept through Rosehill that night, soft and relentless, tapping against cottage windows and hushing the streets. The confession of George Minton had seemingly closed the case. Inspector Graves said so, the newspapers agreed, and Mrs. Drake, dressed in black, had even given a statement to the Times of Hampshire thanking dear Miss Marple for her wisdom. And yet, Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by her bedside lamp, reading an old gardening book she wasn't really reading, her mind returning again and again to the words Minton had said in the churchyard. "She never asked me to do it." It was the pause before he spoke that troubled her, not the words themselves, but the silence between them. It was a silence that spoke of something left unsaid. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a polite visit to Mrs. Drake. The widow received her in the drawing room, a fine picture of morning decorum, though her hands trembled when she poured the tea. "You've been very brave, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be difficult, adjusting to quietness again." "Yes," Helena said softly. "The house feels so empty now." Miss Marple stirred her cup, watching the swirl of milk and tea. "Curious, isn't it, how grief changes a place? It clings to the curtains, hides in corners." Helena forced a smile. "You make it sound almost alive." "Oh, grief is alive," Miss Marple said mildly. "But guilt, I think, is louder." Helena's hand froze on the handle of her cup. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all," Miss Marple said, almost kindly. "Only that guilt has a way of echoing through a house, even after justice is done. I noticed, when I came in, that your mantel clock had stopped, just as your husband's watch did. Odd coincidence, don't you think?" Helena's eyes widened, then dropped. "It stopped last night." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "just after Mr. Minton was arrested, I suppose." The silence that followed was brittle, like porcelain before it breaks. Helena rose abruptly. "I think, Miss Marple, I'd like to rest now. These last days have been exhausting." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising with her. "I shall leave you to your peace. I only hope it is genuine peace, and not the kind that comes from simply believing you've escaped notice." Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of damp earth and lilac. Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, glancing back at the tall windows. One curtain twitched. A shadow moved behind it. She sighed. "Poor woman," she murmured. "She'll never admit it, but she knew. She may not have swung the blow, but she lit the fuse." That evening, Inspector Graves visited again, finding Miss Marple trimming her rose bushes. "I suppose you've heard," he said. "Mrs. Drake's leaving for the continent next week. Says she needs a fresh start." Miss Marple nodded. "I dare say she does. It's difficult to live among ghosts, Inspector." Graves frowned. "You still think there's more to it?" She looked up at him, eyes calm and wise. "I think there always is. The truth of a crime doesn't end with the arrest, it lingers like a scent. It changes everyone who touched it." Graves rubbed the back of his neck. "You mean she?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean nothing of the sort, my dear Inspector. I only observe that sometimes a person doesn't need to kill to be guilty. Sometimes all it takes is silence, at the right moment." Later, as night settled again over Rosehill, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a letter unopened on the table beside her. The envelope bore a neat, unfamiliar hand. She broke the seal and read, "Dear Miss Marple, thank you for what you've done. You saw what others couldn't, even what I couldn't bear to face. I shall leave quietly. Please think kindly of me, if you can. H.D." Miss Marple folded the letter, placed it beside her teacup, and looked out the window at the silver moon hanging over the village. The clock on her mantel ticked evenly. Not stopped, not at midnight, but alive, steady, and true. Chapter 10. The Letter in the Ashes. The next morning dawned pale and uneasy. The mist rolled in from the meadows, lingering low over Rosehill, and for the first time since the arrest, villagers spoke not of justice, but of the strange sense that something was still unfinished. At a small cottage near St. Mary's Lane, Miss Marple sat before her hearth with the day's post unopened beside her. The fire burned low, mostly embers now, except for one small envelope that had fallen near the grate in the night breeze. It was the same letter Mrs. Drake had written. By mid-morning, Miss Marple decided to burn it. "Some things," she murmured, "are kinder left to smoke." She took the tongs, lifted the folded note, and placed it gently on the glowing coals. The paper curled, turned black, and as it did, a second sheet slipped free from within, smaller, older, and charred along the edges. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She plucked it out just in time. It was a fragment of an old letter, a man's handwriting, faded but legible. "I cannot forgive myself for Margaret. You were right, I was cruel. But if I could make amends, I would. Please, Helena, destroy this. I could not bear it if she knew. L.D." Miss Marple stared at the initials. Leonard Drake. So he had written to his wife, not in anger, but in apology. She sat back, thinking. The missing piece of the puzzle had quietly appeared from the ashes. Leonard Drake had not mocked Helena that night, as Minton believed. He had begged for forgiveness. And Helena, she had shown that letter to Minton. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk to the vicarage, where Reverend Langdon was polishing the silver candlesticks for Sunday service. "My dear Miss Marple," he greeted warmly, "you look thoughtful. A problem in the parish." "One might say that," she said gently. "Tell me, Vicar, do you believe that an omission can be a sin equal to an act?" He smiled faintly. "A moral question before tea. You've caught me off guard. But yes, I should think so. Silence can wound more than words." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely what I thought. Thank you." As she left, she paused by the churchyard gate, glancing at the graves gleaming pale in the mist. "Poor George," she whispered. "He thought he was defending love, but love, when poisoned by deception, is the cruelest master of all." That evening, Inspector Graves arrived again, coat damp from drizzle. "Got word from the station," he said. "Mrs. Drake sailed this afternoon. Left no forwarding address. France, maybe." "I see," said Miss Marple softly. "Well, I dare say she will find life quieter there. But I imagine the nights will be less so." Graves frowned. "You're convinced she's guilty of something, aren't you?" "Oh, no, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and deceptively light. "Only of letting another man carry the burden of her sin. That, alas, is not something one can arrest her for." Later that night, as rain beat gently against the windows, Miss Marple placed the half-burned letter in her desk drawer, wrapped in tissue, beside her diary. She lit a single candle and watched the flame flicker. Outside, the church clock struck midnight. 12 slow, deliberate chimes echoing through the empty streets. But this time, the sound didn't stop. The clock kept ticking, steady and alive, marking the passage of time that once froze at a moment of murder. Miss Marple smiled faintly, murmuring to herself, "Midnight only holds its breath until the truth is found. And now it may rest." Chapter 11. The Return of the Stranger. For nearly a week, Rosehill seemed to breathe again. The rain had passed, the air was clean and sharp, and autumn sunlight slanted through the hedgerows. The villagers, ever quick to restore normalcy, began to forget the ugliness of murder and whispered only occasionally about George Minton. Poor man, really, they said, quite devoted, in his way. Miss Marple, as always, tended her roses and attended tea at the vicarage, quiet and unassuming. She might have been an ordinary old lady, if one didn't notice the way she watched, the small details her eyes gathered like threads, the unease of the postmistress when letters arrived, the new visitor renting the Drake cottage, the odd tension in the air that precedes a storm. For even in peace, Miss Marple knew, human nature rarely stays quiet for long. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Langdon, who first mentioned him. "A rather distinguished gentleman," she said, slicing cake for tea. "Came in on the early train. Tall, grey hair, London manner, the kind that makes you sit straighter without knowing why. He asked about Mrs. Drake's house." "Did he give his name?" Miss Marple asked. "Howard Ellison," Mrs. Langdon replied. "Said he was a cousin." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Ellison," she repeated softly. "How very interesting." That evening, curiosity, that delicate yet irresistible impulse, led her along Mill Lane, where the Drake cottage stood half-shuttered, still faintly smelling of smoke and polish. The garden gate creaked softly as she approached. The front door was open. A man stood in the hall, sleeves rolled, dust in his hair. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was just passing by. I couldn't help noticing someone was in residence again." The man smiled, a tired, kind smile, with eyes that had seen too much. "Ah, you must be Miss Marple. Everyone's told me about you. I'm Howard Ellison, Margaret's brother." "Margaret Ellison?" she asked gently. "The young woman who—" "Yes," he said quietly. "The one Leonard Drake courted before he married. My sister. She's been gone these 5 years, but I never stopped wondering what truly happened between them." Miss Marple looked at him keenly. "I see. And what brings you back now?" He hesitated, then opened his hand. Resting on his palm was a small, silver locket, the same design Miss Marple had once seen on Helena Drake's wrist. "I found this among my sister's things," he said. Inside was a photograph of Leonard Drake. The date on the back is only 3 weeks before her death. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You believe there was a connection?" "I don't just believe it," he said grimly. "I know it. And I mean to find out what he did to her, and whether that woman, Helena, had a hand in it." That night, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, her small lamp casting a golden circle on the page. She began a new entry in her diary. "A stranger returns, bearing an old wound. His purpose is vengeance disguised as justice. But vengeance, I've learned, seldom knows when to stop." She paused, tapping the pen against her chin. "I suspect the Drake affair is not over. There is still something buried, not in the churchyard, but in the heart." 2 days later, whispers began again in Rosehill. The stranger had been seen in the village at odd hours, speaking to those who once knew Leonard Drake, to Mrs. Langdon, to Vera Miles, even to the constable. He asked quiet, pointed questions about that night. And then, one evening, as Miss Marple returned from the grocer's, she saw a figure standing by her gate in the fading light. Howard Ellison. His face was pale, his coat damp from fog. "I found something," he said, voice trembling slightly. "In the attic of the Drake house, letters. Dozens of them. They prove he never stopped writing to my sister." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "And what do you intend to do with them, Mr. Ellison?" He met her gaze, and for the briefest moment she saw the same fever she had seen before, the same desperate need for retribution. "I intend," he said, "to finish what began at midnight." Miss Marple did not speak. She only looked past him, up at the moon rising pale over Rosehill, and whispered to herself, "Then midnight has returned, and it has not yet learned mercy." Chapter 12. Secrets in the Attic. The next morning dawned with a pale sun struggling through drifting fog, and the sound of church bells carried faintly over the hills. Rosehill, for all its calm surface, felt heavy, like a village holding its breath. Miss Marple, however, was brisk and composed as she buttoned her grey coat and took her walking stick. She had decided that it was time to pay another visit to Howard Allison. A man bent on revenge, she knew, was a danger not only to others but to himself, especially when the truth he sought might already be poisoned by grief. The Drake house stood silent at the far end of Mill Lane. Once genteel, now faintly neglected, it wore an air of tired dignity, as if it had endured too much and would rather be left alone. The garden gate sagged, and a single shutter banged softly in the breeze. She found Howard in the attic, sleeves rolled, dust on his face, and a half-open trunk before him. Faded letters lay scattered like fallen leaves. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "I never refuse an invitation to an attic," Miss Marple replied lightly. "One learns more from dust than from conversation, I often think." He managed a faint smile and handed her one of the letters. The paper was yellowed, the ink brown with age. "My dearest Margaret, I have written and torn up this letter half a dozen times. I cannot bear the thought of hurting you, but Helena insists. She believes our friendship unwise now that we are both to be married. I have tried to reason with her, but she is quite set. I beg you not to think ill of me. I did love you, truly, but duty has a cruel way of disguising itself as honor. Leonard." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully. "So they were parted not by scandal, but by persuasion," she murmured. "And you think Helena was behind it?" "I know she was," Howard said bitterly. "Margaret wrote in her diary, said Helena visited her the week before she died. She came to make sure Margaret understood that Leonard belonged to her alone." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And the week after that, your sister took her own life." He looked away. "She was found by the river. Everyone said accident, but I never believed it." Miss Marple laid a gloved hand on the trunk. "And you came back here now because you heard Leonard Drake was dead?" "Yes," he said. "And because I thought it might finally be justice." For a while, neither spoke. The wind sighed through the rafters. Dust drifted lazily through sunlight that spilled from the small attic window. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "Tell me, Mr. Allison, have you shown these letters to anyone else?" "No. Only you." "Good. Because, if I may say so, they tell a different story from the one you think." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She took up another letter, more recent, the ink darker. "Here," she said. "This was written a week before Leonard's death. Helena, I have tried to make peace with what we did. I cannot. Margaret's death will not leave me. I cannot live under this roof any longer without feeling her here. You must tell him the truth, or I will." Miss Marple looked up. "You see, my dear Mr. Allison, Leonard Drake knew what had happened. And he intended to reveal it. But someone made sure he never did." Howard's expression hardened. "You mean Helena killed him?" "I mean," Miss Marple said softly, "she gave reason enough for someone else to do it for her." They descended to the parlor, where the light had faded to a gentle dusk. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the first lamps flicker on along the lane. "Mr. Allison," she said, "if you truly want justice, you must give those letters to Inspector Graves, every one of them. Secrets are dangerous things to carry, and they rarely stay quiet once unearthed." He hesitated. "And if the police don't believe me?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then let them not believe. Truth, I've found, has a way of making itself known when the time is right." That night, back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed a single entry in her diary. "Helena Drake's guilt runs deeper than blood. She destroyed 2 souls, one by persuasion, one by silence. But Howard's anger burns too brightly. Fire cannot cure fire." Outside, thunder murmured far away, not yet a storm, but the promise of one. The kind that gathers quietly, waiting for the next revelation to strike. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, whispering into the darkness. The dead are never truly gone, not until the living stop rewriting their story. Chapter 13. A storm over Rosehill. The rain began before dawn. Not the gentle kind that washed the hedgerows clean, but a restless, relentless downpour that hammered the rooftops and turned the narrow lanes into ribbons of mud. By the time Miss Marple drew back her curtains, the sky was a slate sheet of cloud and the air tasted of thunder. She stood for a long while, watching the storm gather strength over the church spire. "It will be a day for confessions," she murmured. At Rosehill Hall, the mood was no less turbulent. Helena Drake sat alone in the drawing-room, the pale silk of her gown catching the dim light like water. The letter Miss Marple had found, the one Leonard had written before his death, now lay open on the table before her. She had read it a dozen times, and yet it did not change. "You must tell him the truth, or I will." Her hand trembled as she folded it once more. She had burned the others, all the ones that hinted at what truly happened 20 years ago by the river. But this one had survived, hidden away in Leonard's desk, waiting like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. When the doorbell rang, she flinched. Inspector Graves entered without ceremony, rain dripping from his coat. "Mrs. Drake," he said gravely, "I think it's time you and I had another talk." "I've told you everything," Helena said, her voice brittle. "Everything you remember," Graves corrected. "But not, I suspect, everything you know." He laid a small bundle on the table, the letters, now sealed in evident sleeves. "Mr. Ellison brought these to me last night." Color drained from Helena's face. He had no right. "He had every right," Graves interrupted sharply. "Your husband's death is no longer a matter of accident. The coroner's report came in this morning. Leonard Drake was poisoned." The words fell into the silence like a hammer. Helena stared at him, her lips parting soundlessly. "Poisoned?" Graves nodded. "A slow-acting compound. Likely administered with his evening brandy. And whoever did it knew precisely what they were doing." Outside, the thunder rolled closer, a deep growl shaking the window panes. Miss Marple arrived moments later, her umbrella dripping and her face calm but intent. "Ah, Inspector," she said, removing her gloves. "I see you've brought the storm indoors." Graves gave a weary smile. "It seems so, Miss Marple. I could use your insight." Miss Marple turned her gentle gaze on Helena. "You look pale, my dear. Perhaps a little brandy." Helena's eyes flickered, a fraction too quickly. Miss Marple saw it. "Ah," she said softly. "No brandy, then. Sensible." The clock ticked on the mantelpiece, the only sound for several moments. Finally, Helena spoke. "I didn't kill him." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. "You loved him, in your way. But you feared something else, didn't you? The truth about Margaret Ellison." Helena's breath caught. She chose to end her life. Miss Marple shook her head gently. She was driven to it. By a woman who convinced her that the man she loved despised her. "You sent that letter, Helena, the one that said Leonard had repented, that he wished her well, that he would never see her again. You forged it." Helena stared, horrified. "How could you know that?" "Because the ink used in your old letters is the same shade, same make, manufactured only in Paris, at Maison Duval. And your initials are on the bottle. I saw it in your study." Helena rose unsteadily, clutching the back of her chair. You think I killed Leonard to keep that secret?" Miss Marple's tone was almost kind. "I think someone else did. Someone who knew, and wanted to protect you." Graves frowned. "Who?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the hallway. "Perhaps we should ask your housekeeper, Mrs. Wren." At that exact moment, lightning flashed, and a crash echoed from the back corridor. Graves spun around. "Stay here." He dashed through the doorway, Miss Marple close behind. They found Mrs. Wren crumpled on the floor beside the servant's door, a small bottle shattered beside her hand. The bitter smell of cyanide filled the air. "Too late," Miss Marple whispered, kneeling beside the still body. "She's gone." Graves looked grim. "She must have heard us." Miss Marple nodded slowly, and knew the truth was about to surface. She was with Margaret the day she died, and with Leonard on the night he was poisoned. The loyal servant, loyal to the very end. She rose, brushing the dust from her skirt. Poor creature. It is always the ones who love most who destroy most completely. That night, the storm broke fully over Rosehill. Miss Marple sat by her window, listening to the rain lash against the glass. The letters lay neatly stacked beside her teacup. One forgery, one death by guilt, one by mercy, she murmured. And a woman left to live with ghosts. She closed her diary, wrote one final line. Justice seldom arrives with thunder, sometimes it comes quietly, in the sound of rain washing away the lies. Outside, the lightning faded. Rosehill slept, but the village would never quite forget the night the storm confessed for them all. Chapter 14. The Whisper at the Vicarage. The rain had cleared by morning, but the sky over Rosehill remained bruised and heavy, as though the storm had left something unfinished behind. Puddles glistened on the cobblestones, and a faint mist clung to the graveyard walls beside St. Mary's Church. Miss Marple, in her neat blue coat and sensible hat, walked slowly along the path toward the vicarage. In her hand, she carried a sealed envelope, the copy of Leonard Drake's last letter, the one she had rescued from the ashes. She had read it 3 times over breakfast, searching every line for what wasn't said. The vicarage door opened before she could knock. Reverend Langdon stood there, still in his shirt-sleeves, his face pale from a night without sleep. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, forcing a tired smile. "You heard about Mrs. Wren, I suppose?" "Yes," she said softly. "A sad end, though, perhaps, not unexpected." He stepped aside to let her in. "I've had parishioners calling since dawn. The whole village is in an uproar again. They can't decide whether to pity Mrs. Drake or fear her." "They're not wrong on either count," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat near the fireplace. "But the truth, Reverend, is seldom so simple as the whispers that carry it." He nodded gravely, pouring her tea. But when she handed him the envelope, his hand trembled slightly. "What's this?" "Leonard Drake's final letter," she said. "The original is gone, but I made a copy before giving the evidence to Inspector Graves. You were kind enough to offer counsel to Mrs. Drake in her grief, so I thought you ought to read it." Langdon hesitated, then opened the envelope. His eyes moved across the words, his expression changing, confusion first, then pain. "You were right, I was cruel. But if I could make amends, I would. Please, Helena, destroy this. I could not bear it if she knew. L.D." When he finished, he looked up at Miss Marple, his lips pressed tightly together. "You think this proves Helena's innocence?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that it proves Leonard Drake was trying to make peace, and that someone didn't want that peace to exist." Langdon's jaw tightened. He rose abruptly, turning to stare out the rain-streaked window. "There are things, Miss Marple, best left buried. Some wounds in this parish run deep." "Indeed," she said softly. "Deeper than most graves, I dare say." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11. The sound was solemn, echoing through the old vicarage. Miss Marple waited, silent, until Langdon finally turned back toward her. "I must ask you something," she said quietly. "When Margaret Ellison died, you were curate at the old parish in Malcolm, were you not?" He froze. "Yes, I was." "And she confessed something to you, something you have kept all these years under the seal of faith." He swallowed hard. "I cannot." "I don't ask you to break your vow," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "only to confirm whether that confession might have changed how we see the past. Because, Reverend, I believe she didn't take her own life. I believe someone helped her, and it wasn't Helena Drake." Langdon's eyes widened, horror dawning slowly. "Good heavens, you can't mean." "Not Helena," Miss Marple repeated, "but a man who loved her. A man who thought he was saving her from scandal. A man who has lived with the weight of that secret ever since." The silence between them was deafening. At last, Langdon sank into a chair, his head bowed. "You know, then," he whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "I suspected. The dosage was too precise, the circumstances too clean. Leonard Drake may have been poisoned, but his wife's hand did not hold the glass." Tears filled Langdon's eyes. "I tried to spare her. Margaret begged me. She said she couldn't bear the shame, the whispers. I thought," his voice broke, "I thought it was mercy." "And when you saw Leonard treating Helena cruelly," Miss Marple said gently, "you feared history repeating itself." Langdon covered his face with his hands. "God forgive me." Miss Marple rose and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "My dear Reverend, There are worse sins than compassion misguided. But justice must still be spoken, not shouted, perhaps, but whispered where it will be heard. He looked up, broken. What will you do? Nothing, she said softly. The dead are at rest. Mrs. Wren has paid for her silence, and you have paid in conscience. I think that is punishment enough. She walked to the window, watching the mist lift from the churchyard. But you will tell Inspector Graves that you wish to leave Rosehill. I expect he'll find that reasonable. The truth, once spoken, often asks for distance. Langdon nodded, voice trembling. And Helena? She will live, said Miss Marple, as we all must, between guilt and gratitude. As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the church bells began to ring faintly in the wind. The sound was thin but pure, rising above the still-dripping trees. She paused at the gate and looked back once, at the tall, lonely figure framed in the vicarage window. Then she turned toward the village lane, where puddles reflected the pale sunlight now breaking through the clouds. Confession, she murmured, is never the end, only the beginning of truth. Chapter 15. The Second Midnight. The following week brought sunlight, pale and uncertain, like a truce between the rain and the coming autumn. Rosehill began to breathe again. The villagers swept their steps, opened their shops, and spoke of the tragedy only in lowered voices, as though the mere mention of it might summon another storm. Miss Marple, however, knew that peace in Rosehill was never more fragile than when it seemed secure. She sat knitting near her front window that morning, watching the preparations for the harvest fete on the village green. Children hung paper garlands, and Mrs. Price from the bakery supervised the cake stall with military precision. It all seemed perfectly ordinary, until the church clock chimed noon. Or rather, tried to. The first strike was clear and true, echoing down the cobbled street. The second faltered, a strange, metallic echo that made Miss Marple look up. The sound was oddly familiar, the same dull clang that had once marked midnight, the night Leonard Drake died. She set down her knitting. When the final note faded, Miss Marple put on her coat and hat. She crossed the green with brisk steps, ignoring the drizzle that had begun to fall again. The church doors stood open, the air inside cool and smelling faintly of wax and dust. Up in the bell tower, Arthur Gibbs, the young caretaker, was polishing the brass fittings when she arrived. Oh, Miss Marple. Nearly gave me a fright, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Clock's acting queer again. Strikes wrong hours since the storm. Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward to the massive clock face. Since the storm, you say? Or since the repairs after Mr. Drake's funeral? Arthur frowned. Well, both, I suppose. The mechanism jammed that night, you remember. Took me near 3 days to get it working again. And who was helping you then? She asked lightly. Mr. Allison, the lawyer. Said he knew a bit about clockwork. He's the one fixed the pendulum weight. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, how clever of him. That afternoon, as the fete filled the green with laughter and bunting, Miss Marple made her quiet rounds, first to the cake stall, then to the flower tent, and finally to where Inspector Graves stood by the coconut shy, pretending not to enjoy himself. I hope you're not winning all the prizes, Inspector, she teased gently. Graves chuckled. Only observing, Miss Marple. Peaceful day for once. I wonder, she said, glancing toward the church tower. Peace, you know, often disguises movement. Like a clock that ticks smoothly but keeps the wrong time. He gave her a puzzled look. Meaning? Miss Marple folded her hands. Meaning that Mr. Allison's story about the night of the murder doesn't align with the clock's repair log. He claimed he was home by 11:30. Yet, according to young Arthur, the clock stopped again that same night, precisely at 12, when Leonard Drake died. Graves stiffened. You're suggesting. I'm not suggesting, she said softly. I'm remembering. And memory, like time, has a rhythm. When something repeats itself, Inspector, it's often because it was never truly stopped. As evening fell, the fate's lanterns began to glow, casting golden reflections across the wet grass. Miss Marple lingered near the churchyard, eyes fixed on the clock face high above. The hands pointed to 11:59. The crowd was singing, the children running, and yet Miss Marple's heart ticked faster than the clock itself. Then it happened. A faint click, followed by the smallest jolt of the mechanism, and the clock hand moved backward. Just 1 minute. 12 o'clock again. And then the chime, not one of joy, but of perfect, chilling repetition. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave the tower. So, she whispered, the watch was not the only thing that stopped at midnight. Later that night, she found Inspector Graves at the inn, studying a glass of ale as though it contained answers. She placed a small object on the table between them, a broken brass gear, its edge coated in something dark. I found this beneath the clock housing, she said. Mr. Allison's thumbprint is on it. Graves examined it grimly. Grease and, what's that, dried varnish? Poison, Miss Marple said quietly. The same compound that killed Leonard Drake. It was painted on the inside of the brandy decanter, the one Ellison gifted them. Clever, really, but not quite clever enough. Graves exhaled slowly. You think Ellison killed him, not for love, but to keep him silent. Miss Marple nodded. Leonard was about to reveal that Ellison had falsified the Ellison estate records. The watch was his alibi, a perfect piece of theatre. He said it to stop at midnight to tie the death to Helena's house, not his own. Graves stared at her. And now? Now, she said calmly, we wait. Time, as ever, will betray him. Outside, the church clock struck midnight again, but this time it did not falter. Its sound rolled steady and clear across Rosehill, washing away the lies that had bound it for so long. Miss Marple rose, tucking her gloves neatly into her bag. It seems, she said, that the village of Rosehill has lived through 2 midnights, but only one will bring the... Chapter 16. The Second Midnight. It was the first fine day Rosehill had seen in weeks. The storm had passed, the air smelled faintly of wet grass and lilac, and the church bells rang cheerfully for the village fete, as if the world had decided to forget the recent tragedy. Children ran along the green with paper flags, the baker's stall overflowed with scones, and old Mrs. Porter was loudly insisting her jam deserved the blue ribbon again. To an outsider, it was a scene of perfect English peace. But Miss Marple noticed something different in the air, not joy, but forced gaiety, the kind that hides whispers behind laughter. She had come, as always, in her modest grey dress, hat neatly pinned, and her knitting bag over one arm. She smiled at the vicar's wife, tasted the lemonade, and observed quietly, just as she always did when the village pretended nothing was wrong. Near the church gate, Inspector Graves was talking to Helena Drake. He looked uncomfortable in plain clothes. The police badge in his pocket was almost visible by habit. Mrs. Drake, he was saying, I wanted to assure you that the case is officially closed. Mrs. Wren's death has been ruled self-inflicted. There will be no further inquiries. Helena gave a small, brittle smile. Then perhaps Rosehill can breathe again. Graves nodded, though his eyes lingered on her too long. If there's anything you need. There isn't, she said, turning away. I have all I need. Miss Marple, watching from a distance, saw the flicker of unease in Helena's eyes. Guilt, yes, but not the guilt of murder. Something more private. Something that still weighed upon her. At the far end of the green stood the antique stall, run by Mr. Pritchard, the old clock repairer. Rows of pocket watches glimmered under the morning sun, their ticking forming a strange, delicate music. Miss Marple's eyes caught one at once, a small silver piece, faintly scratched along its back. The engraving read, LD. Her heart gave a single, quiet jolt. She picked it up carefully. This is a fine watch, Mr. Pritchard. Quite old. He nodded proudly. A gentleman brought it in some months ago. Said it belonged to his late employer, wanted it cleaned up and working again. Poor chap never came back for it. His name? She asked. Langdon, I think it was. Reverend Langdon. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Ah, yes. His left Rosehill. Pritchard wound the small key and handed the watch to her. Curious thing, it always stops at midnight, no matter how well I clean it. Runs for a few hours, then freezes. Like it remembers something. She turned the piece over in her palm. Indeed, the hand stood at 12, perfectly aligned, unmoving. The watch that stopped at midnight. Later, as the fate gave way to dusk, Miss Marple lingered near the church. The laughter faded, lanterns were lit, and the air filled with the scent of wet grass and smoke from the food stalls. She stood beneath the yew tree, staring at the small clock in her hand. Memory, she murmured. That's all time really is, a way to keep our sins from running together. Behind her, Helena Drake's footsteps approached slowly. You found it, Helena said softly. Leonard's watch. Yes, Miss Marple said, without turning. Curious, isn't it, how some things return exactly when we need them? Helena's eyes glistened. I tried to forget him. But everything in this village reminds me. Even the clocks. Miss Marple looked at her gently. Clocks, my dear, do not lie. They only stop when someone winds them too tight. Helena looked puzzled, then frowned as she saw the watch face. It stopped again. Yes, Miss Marple said. At the exact moment Leonard died. The church bell tolled 8, and as the sound faded, Miss Marple opened the back of the pocket watch with a small click. Inside, beneath the mechanism, a thin folded scrap of paper was tucked neatly against the gears. Helena gasped. What is that? Miss Marple handed it to her. Why don't we see? Helena unfolded it, and her breath caught. The note, written in Leonard Drake's unmistakable hand, read, If you are reading this, then I have failed to make her see reason. Tell Helena the truth, for Margaret's sake. She must forgive herself, and you, my dear Langdon, must forgive me. Helena stared at it, trembling. Langdon, he knew. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. He knew everything. And he carried that burden for years. But Leonard tried to free him, and you. The watch stopped because it was opened that night. Someone read this, and time, quite literally, froze. Helena pressed the note to her chest, tears falling silently. So it wasn't hatred. It was love. Miss Marple nodded. Love, yes. But love that turned inward too long becomes poison. Your husband died with forgiveness on his lips, and your conscience can live with that if you choose. The fete ended with fireworks over the meadows, soft, fading lights reflected in the stream. Helena Drake stood among the villagers, her face lit briefly in red and gold, the tears on her cheeks indistinguishable from the rain that began to fall again. Miss Marple stood apart, her shawl drawn close, the broken watch ticking faintly in her hand, for the first time moving past midnight. When time begins again, she whispered, it means the truth has been spoken. And somewhere beyond the churchyard, the wind carried the faint sound of a man's laughter, the kind that lives only in memory. Chapter 17. The Clockmaker's Secret. The following morning dawned bright and clear, as though the sky itself wished to cleanse the memory of the fate. The church bells rang early, their sound clean and soft over Rosehill, and for once, there was no fog upon the lane. Miss Marple sat by her window, a teacup steaming beside her, the silver pocket watch open on the table. It ticked faintly now, a stubborn little rhythm, as though it had decided to live again. She had spent the night thinking of that note hidden within. Tell Helena the truth, for Margaret's sake. She must forgive herself, and you, my dear Langdon, must forgive me. Forgiveness, she thought, was the thread running through every tangled knot of this story. But someone, somewhere, had wanted that thread cut. By mid-morning, Miss Marple set out for the clockmaker's shop, a narrow building near the village green with a wooden sign that read Pritchard and Sons, time restored since 1897. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brass and oil. Dozens of clocks lined the walls, some ticking, some silent, all marking slightly different versions of time. Mr. Pritchard, tall and stooped, looked up from his bench. Ah, Miss Marple. Come about the watch again, have you? Yes, she said, smiling. It's been most obliging. I wondered if I might trouble you for a little history. He chuckled. History's all I've got, What would you like to know? The gentleman who brought it to you, she said. Reverend Langdon. You're sure it was him? Certain as sunrise, said Pritchard. He came in last winter, before Christmas. Said it belonged to a dear friend and needed mending. Paid in cash, no questions asked. But, he frowned suddenly. He wasn't alone that day. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Oh, who was with him? Pritchard rubbed his chin. Mrs. Drake's maid, the one who, well, poor soul. Mrs. Wren. She did most of the talking. Knew her way around a clock, oddly enough. Told me not to meddle with the back casing. Said it had sentimental value. Did she indeed? Miss Marple murmured. How thoughtful of her. Pritchard nodded. Funny thing, though, I found it open when they left. Didn't think much of it at the time. Miss Marple left the shop quietly, the sun glinting on the cobbles as she walked. So, Mrs. Wren had known about the note, had read Leonard's last message, and feared what it might reveal. That meant the poison had not been an act of devotion alone, it had been fear, pure and simple. Fear of what Helena might do if she knew the truth, that Leonard's final act had been one of mercy, not betrayal. And yet, Miss Marple thought, there was still one thing unspoken, one clock that hadn't yet chimed. That evening, Miss Marple took the path to Rosehill Hall once more. The estate loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. She was greeted at the door by Helena Drake, looking strangely calm, her hair loosely pinned and her eyes shadowed but steady. "I knew you'd come," Helena said softly. "You always do." "I wondered," said Miss Marple gently, "if you might let me see Leonard's study once more." Helena hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." The room was unchanged, heavy oak desk, faded curtains, a faint smell of tobacco and dust. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze falling on the empty decanter, the row of family portraits, the clock on the mantelpiece that had not worked in years. She touched it lightly. "Did you know," she said, "that your husband had a habit of hiding small notes in his clocks? The vicar's watch wasn't the only one." Helena frowned. "I didn't." Miss Marple opened the clock face delicately. Inside was another scrap of paper, folded so tightly it had become part of the dust itself. She drew it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, Leonard's, though the ink was faint with age. "If anything happens to me, look to the timepiece. The truth, as ever, keeps time with the heart." Helena sank into the armchair, whispering, "He tried to tell me. All these years." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "He did. And now, at last, you've heard him." Outside, the evening deepened. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then again, and for the first time in 20 years it began to chime. Helena looked up, startled. "It's working." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Because now, my dear, everything else is, too." Later that night, as Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky full of pale stars, she carried the small silver watch in her glove hand. It ticked gently, steady, alive. She smiled to herself. "People think time hides secrets," she murmured. "But really, it reveals them, once you've the patience to listen." And somewhere behind her, in the distance, the church clock struck 12 once more, not a dead man's hour this time, but a living one. A heartbeat reborn. Chapter 18. The Silence Before Dawn. The next morning was so still that even the birds seemed to hesitate before singing. A faint silver mist lay across Rosehill, softening every edge, every roof and tree, as if the village were holding its breath. Miss Marple woke before sunrise, as she always did. Her cottage was filled with the faint smell of lavender and the tick of clocks, all of them keeping different times, yet somehow in harmony. She sat at her writing desk, her diary open, the small silver watch beside her. It was ticking, slow, steady, alive, but she knew that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what it had remembered. "Time keeps the truth," she wrote neatly, "but people do their best to bury it." She laid down her pen, folded her hands, and waited for the first chime of morning. The sound came faintly from the church tower, 6 slow notes echoing through mist and silence. It was a comforting sound, yet something about it made her frown. The bells were late. At 7, she took her usual walk into the village. The roads were damp with dew, and thin curls of chimney smoke drifted lazily upward. Near the bakery, she met Inspector Graves, who looked rather more rumpled than usual. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tugging at his hat. "You're out early." "I might say the same of you," she replied with a smile. "Something amiss." He sighed. "You could say that. Reverend Langdon's gone missing." "Gone missing," she repeated softly. "He told me he was leaving Rosehill." "He was meant to take the early train," said Graves, "but the porter says he never boarded. His luggage was found on the platform, untouched." Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "I see." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "It may be nothing, but something about it sits wrong with me. He left no note, and Mrs. Drake's maid—" He stopped abruptly, grimacing. "Forgive me. Old habits." "Perfectly understandable," she said calmly. "But tell me, did anyone see him after the fete?" "One man," said Graves. "Pritchard, the clockmaker. Said the vicar came by his shop late that evening, after dark. Wanted to collect the Drake watch, of all things. Pritchard told him you'd already taken it. How odd, Miss Marple murmured. He must have known that. By the time she reached the churchyard, the mist was lifting, revealing the pale grass glistening with dew. She walked slowly between the headstones, her cane tapping gently on the stones. Near the back wall, she found what she half expected, a small patch of disturbed earth near the boundary hedge. Someone had knelt there recently. The grass was flattened, the soil dark and fresh. Miss Marple crouched, her eyes scanning the ground. There, glinting faintly in the morning light, was something metallic. A key. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her fingers. It was old, brass, and engraved faintly with 2 letters, LD. She went straight to Rosehill Hall, where Helena Drake answered the door herself, dressed simply in grey, her eyes shadowed but clear. Miss Marple, she said softly, you've found something. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. This key, for instance. Do you recognize it? Helena took it, frowning. Leonard's study key. But I thought I'd locked it away. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You did. But someone else must have borrowed it recently. Reverend Langdon, I imagine. Helena looked startled. Why would he? To put something back, Miss Marple said gently. Or to take something out. Inside the study, the morning light filtered through thin curtains, painting dust motes in pale gold. Miss Marple moved to the desk, where the mantel clock now ticked quietly, alive once more. She examined the small drawer beneath it, the one that had held the old note. It was empty. Helena's hand flew to her mouth. The letter. The one from Leonard. Gone, Miss Marple said softly. And with it, perhaps, the last link between the 2 men. She turned toward the window, where the mist still hovered low over the garden. Reverend Langdon wanted to leave, but something drew him back. A conscience does that, when it isn't at rest. Helena's voice trembled. You think he? I think, said Miss Marple, that he went to say goodbye. To Leonard, to you, to all of it. But guilt is a heavy traveller, my dear. Some journeys it never lets you finish. That night, the villagers would recall hearing the church bell toll once, long before dawn. Just one solitary chime, and then silence. And at that same hour, Miss Marple, sitting at her desk with her candle low, wrote in her diary. The clock stops not when the hands falter, but when the heart does. Perhaps he has found peace, at last. She closed the book, blew out the candle, and sat for a long while in the darkness. Outside, the first pale light of dawn touched the rooftops of Rosehill, turning the mist to silver. The silence, at last, was complete. Chapter 19. The Empty Pew. The morning after the news of Reverend Langdon's disappearance, the village seemed quieter than usual, not mournful, exactly, but waiting. Waiting for the next whisper, the next revelation, the next name to fall from someone's trembling lips. At breakfast, Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. The clock on her mantel ticked in rhythm with her thoughts. She had always trusted silence more than talk, and the silence of Rosehill today was louder than gossip ever could be. She took her shawl, her walking stick, and her small black handbag, then set out for St. Mildred's Church. The church was empty when she arrived. The heavy wooden doors stood ajar, letting in a thin shaft of light that fell directly on the center aisle. Dust drifted lazily through the beam like drifting snow. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and damp stone. Candles, half melted from last night's vigil, flickered uncertainly. She moved forward slowly, her footsteps echoing softly against the flagstone floor. Then she saw it, the vicar's coat, folded neatly on the front pew. And on the coat lay something else, the silver watch, stopped again, at exactly 12:07. Miss Marple stood very still. So, she whispered, you came back to put time right, and found it had stopped for you instead. She sat gently on the pew beside the coat. Her eyes moved to the pulpit, the one from which Reverend Langdon had preached for years about truth, forgiveness, and faith. There was something solemn, almost tender, about the stillness of the place. A sound broke the silence, the faint creak of the side door. It was Inspector Graves, hat in hand, face grave. Morning, Miss Marple. Thought I might find you here. You found him? She asked quietly. He nodded. Yes. Down by the river, near the old mill. Looks like he slipped and fell. He hesitated. But there's something off. He had no hat, no walking stick. Just his prayer book and a letter. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. A letter. Graves nodded again. Addressed to you. He handed her a small envelope, the edges damp, the ink blurred but legible. Her name, Miss Jane Marple, written in careful, clerical script. She opened it slowly. My dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, then I am already beyond the reach of confession. I have long carried a secret that has eaten at me like rust. Leonard Drake was my friend once. My brother, almost. But friendship can turn bitter when envy takes root. That night, the night he died, I meant only to confront him. He had discovered my part in the affair with Helena's inheritance, and he threatened to expose me. We quarreled, tempers rose, and he fell, struck his head upon the hearth. It was an accident, but I fled like a coward and let another man be blamed. When the watch stopped at midnight, I saw it as a sign. The hour truth died in me. I tried to forget, but Rosehill remembers everything, doesn't it? Tell Helena I am sorry. Tell her I loved her once, but not as I should have. Tell her I tried to make peace with God, but I could not. The past tolls louder than any church bell. Forgive me, if you can. Arthur Langdon. Miss Marple read the letter twice, once with her eyes, once with her heart. When she finally folded it, she looked up at Graves. He confessed to you, in his way. That's a kind of justice. Graves shook his head. He didn't mean to kill him. But it doesn't make it easier. No, she agreed quietly, but perhaps it makes it clearer. She rose, taking the silver watch from the pew. For a moment, she held it up to the light, watching how the still hands gleamed in the morning sun. Then she pressed the small side button. The second hand began to move again, slow, steady, unhurried. Time, she said softly, has a merciful way of beginning again. When she left the church, the villagers were already gathering by the gate, whispering in subdued tones. Helena stood apart, her grey dress blending with the mist, her eyes distant but dry. Miss Marple walked to her quietly and placed the letter in her gloved hands. He loved you, she said simply. In the wrong way, perhaps, but truly. He wanted you to know that. Helena nodded, unable to speak. The watch ticked faintly between them, a small, stubborn sound of life. And as the church bell rang out the noon hour, Miss Marple turned toward the road leading home. She did not look back. That evening, as the village settled once more into its rhythms, she sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The watch lay on the mantel beside her. The ticking filled the quiet room like a heartbeat. The truth, she thought, is a kind of resurrection. Painful, but necessary. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. And somewhere far away, the bells of Rosehill tolled once more, soft, forgiving, final. Chapter 20. The Widow's Confession. It was late afternoon when Helena Drake came to see Miss Marple. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the kind that never quite arrives, but lingers as a promise. The garden outside the cottage was still, even the sparrows seemed subdued. Miss Marple looked up from her armchair as Helena entered. She wore no hat, her dark hair pinned neatly, her face pale but calm. In her hand, she carried the silver watch, its chain coiled like a sleeping serpent. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You must be tired." Helena sat opposite her, placing the watch carefully on the table between them. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Only the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel filled the silence. "I thought it should be with you," Helena said at last. "Arthur meant it for Leonard. And Leonard, well, he would have trusted you." Miss Marple inclined her head. A very thoughtful gesture. Helena smiled faintly. "No, Miss Marple. It's not thoughtfulness. It's guilt." There was no tremor in her voice now, only the slow, weary cadence of a woman who had rehearsed her words too many times. "I've lived with it for years," she said. "And I suppose Arthur thought his sin was the worst of it. But he didn't know the whole story. None of you did." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Would you like to tell me, my dear?" Helena stared into the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Leonard and our marriage was not as it appeared. We were companions, yes, but not much more. He was proud, and I was foolish. I let Arthur comfort me. At first, it was only conversation, letters, glances, nothing more. But the heart is a traitor, Miss Marple. You know that as well as I. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Better than most. One night, Helena continued, Leonard found a letter, one I had written to Arthur but never sent. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. He confronted me. He said he'd see to it that Arthur lost his parish, that the truth came out. He left the house furious. Her voice wavered now. I followed him. He'd gone to the church. They argued. I saw Arthur strike him, not with force, just desperation. Leonard stumbled, hit his head. I screamed, and Arthur turned to me. We both knew what we'd done. She took a trembling breath. He wanted to call the police, but I begged him not to. I told him I'd say Leonard had gone to London. That no one need know. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were kind. Helena's hands tightened in her lap. Arthur thought he'd hidden the truth for my sake, but he didn't know that I moved the body, that I laid the watch beside him when I dragged him back to the study. I wanted it to look like he'd died writing, something poetic, foolish, sentimental. She gave a short, bitter laugh. I even stopped the watch myself. Midnight. I thought it might protect him somehow. Or me. The ticking clock on the mantel seemed louder now, a quiet reminder of time's endless patience. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And the letter. The one Arthur thought Leonard wrote. I wrote it, Helena said softly. All of it. I forged it, to make it seem like Leonard had forgiven me, that he'd gone away by choice. I couldn't bear the pity, the whispers. Her eyes glistened. So you see, Miss Marple, Arthur carried a burden that wasn't fully his. He died thinking he alone was guilty. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then she said gently, And now you've carried yours far enough. Helena bowed her head. What will you do with what I've told you? Nothing, Miss Marple said simply. The law cannot touch what time has already taken. And I suspect both men have already answered to a higher authority. Helena let out a trembling breath, half sob, half relief. You're kind. No, said Miss Marple, just old enough to know when punishment has already been served. They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire burning low, the shadows lengthening across the small room. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the windowpane, whispering softly like an echo of long-forgotten voices. Finally, Helena stood. I'll leave Rosehill, she said. It's time. I've lived too long among ghosts. Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes leaving is a kind of forgiveness, too. Helena smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. Goodbye, Miss Marple. And thank you for seeing what others could not. When she was gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while, the watch still ticking on the table before her. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, and smiled to herself. We all stop at midnight, she murmured. But some hearts start again, if only they find the courage to confess. That night, she wound the watch, placed it on her mantel beside the small photograph of her late nephew, and watched its steady hand circle once more. Outside, the rain began at last, soft, cleansing, and unending.